Hey, welcome to Audio Listeners. We're all about breaking down the best ideas from great books.
Want to learn from all those amazing books out there, but you just can't find the time?
That's exactly what we do. We pull the key ideas from the best books on growth and motivation.
So you can boost your personal growth, gain powerful knowledge, and find that daily motivation for free.
Here's the cool part. Every book is a complete playlist, so you can learn from start to finish.
So go check out the playlist section. You're going to find something that helps for sure.
And hey, if you like what we're doing, do us a favor and hit that like button.
You're not going to want to miss what's next, so make sure you subscribe for the latest books.
And one last thing, what book should we cover next? Let us know right down in the comments.
Today we are diving deep into a topic that's, let's face it, pretty fascinating: the world of psychological influence and attraction. And we're going to do it using Robert Greene's incredible book, The Art of Seduction, as our guide.
You've probably asked yourself this before, right? What is it about certain people? They walk into a room and it's like they have this magnetic pull. You can't quite put your finger on it, but you definitely can't ignore it. Well, according to Robert Greene, this isn't some kind of magic or a gift you're just born with. Nope, he says it's a craft. It's an art form that's built on a deep understanding of human psychology and our hidden desires. And this isn't just about romance either. It's about social power and influence across the board. To make sense of all this, Greene gives us the concept of archetypes. Now, don't think of these as strict personality types you have to fit into. Instead, think of them as powerful roles or patterns that a person can step into. Each one taps into a very specific fantasy, something buried deep inside pretty much all of us. So, Greene lays out 9 of these distinct archetypes, plus, and this is really important, one anti-type that you've got to avoid at all costs. We're about to break down the core strategies of some of the most compelling ones right now.
Let's kick things off with a group of archetypes who are absolute masters at becoming the living, breathing embodiment of someone else's secret dreams. They do more than just attract you. They offer a complete escape from reality.
Okay, so what's so interesting here is you're looking at 2 sides of the same coin. You've got the siren, who represents the ultimate male fantasy, this promise of total release from responsibility, a dive into pure pleasure. And then you have the rake, who embodies a powerful female fantasy. Yeah, they might be a little dangerous, maybe not the most honest, but that intense, laser-focused attention, it's completely thrilling.
And this quote just nails the strategy of the ideal lover. This archetype is basically an artist of illusion. They pay close attention, they listen, and they figure out what dreams you had to give up on. Then, they create an illusion that brings that fantasy back to life. In a world that's often disappointing, you can imagine how powerful that is.
All right, so what if the power isn't about fulfilling a fantasy that already exists, but creating a brand new one? This next group of archetypes, they are the masters of presence. They build this irresistible aura that just makes people lean in, wanting to figure them out.
And this breaks it down so well. First, you've got the dandy. They play with their identity, they're fluid, you can't put them in a box. And that suggests a kind of freedom we all secretly want. The natural is the total opposite. They have the sincerity, the spontaneity of a child that just makes you drop your guard. And then there's the coquette, the master of the chase, that hot and cold approach, that push and pull, it keeps you completely hooked.
So here's the thing about the charmer. Their whole method is less about creating a big persona for themselves and more about mastering the art of attention. Greene even calls it seduction without sex. They make you feel like the most interesting person in the world. They tune into your moods, validate your ego, and who doesn't love that? It's an incredibly effective way to win people over.
Wrapping up this group, you've got 2 archetypes whose power really comes from within. The star creates this kind of hazy, dreamlike quality. They're mesmerizing to watch, but they always feel just a little out of reach. And then there's the charismatic. These people just radiate this intense confidence and purpose, a quality a lot of us feel we're missing, which makes them incredibly attractive.
Okay, so we've looked at what works, but it is just as important, if not more so, to understand what pushes people away. So Greene gives us this crucial warning, this counterexample, the anti-seducer. This is the person who actively repels others.
And here are the traits to watch out for. At its core, the anti-seducer is just completely self-absorbed. They talk way too much about themselves, they have zero self-awareness, and, this is the big one, they are totally incapable of shifting their focus to understand what's going on in someone else's head. Greene says the very first step to becoming more influential is to root these qualities out of yourself. So,
After hearing all of that, you might be wondering, okay, where do I fit in? Which of these patterns sounds a little bit like me? And that brings us to maybe the most important part of this whole thing.
Look, the key takeaway here is not to just pick an archetype and start acting. That's not the point. The real power comes from understanding these deep psychological forces at play. It's about seeing the patterns of influence all around you, and more importantly, understanding the parts of your own natural personality that you can amplify.
So I'll leave you with this final question. When you think back on these archetypes, the siren, the rake, the charmer, the coquette, which little pieces do you recognize? Maybe in yourself, or maybe in the people who you find captivating. Because understanding that, well, that's the real first step to mastering this whole art.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down something that really blurs the line between, say, attraction and, well, architecture. We're diving deep into a super calculated 4-phase process of seduction, straight from a really provocative text. So, you might want to forget everything you think you know about romance, because this is a masterclass in strategy.
All right, so the framework we're looking at here, it doesn't treat seduction like some mysterious romantic art form. No, it's a game, a methodical one. It's broken down into 4 clear stages: steering desire, leading astray, the precipice, and then the big one, the final move. And get this, each step is designed to build on the one before it, creating this like inescapable pull.
Okay, so let's jump right into phase 1, stirring desire. This is really where the entire foundation gets laid, brick by careful brick. The main goal here, it's all about getting noticed. But, and this is key, making that attention feel totally natural, almost like it was an accident.
So, according to this source, the very first step is choosing what it calls the perfect victim. Yeah, you heard that right. See, a person who's genuinely happy and content, they're seen as almost impossible to seduce. The ideal target is someone with a hole in their life, you can see. Maybe they're unhappy, isolated, lonely. This gives the seducer a perfect opening to slide in and offer exactly what's missing.
Now, phase 1 isn't about big, flashy gestures. Not at all. It's all about these subtle little moves. You approach indirectly, maybe through a mutual friend. You start sending mixed signals to create some mystery. You subtly poke at their insecurities, creating a need that, surprise, surprise, only you can fill. And you become a master of insinuation, planting ideas so skillfully that the target thinks they came up with them.
And this is a really key tactic right here, creating this kind of confusing depth. By sending these mixed signals, being tough one minute and tender the next, or seeming all spiritual but also really down to earth, the seducer becomes a total enigma. And this contradiction? It's fascinating. It makes the target lean in. They want to figure you out, and that just pulls them deeper and deeper under your influence.
And that, of course, brings us right to phase 2, leading astray. This is where the game gets a whole lot deeper. The goal now is to actively mislead your target's emotions, creating this intoxicating cocktail of pleasure and just complete confusion.
The source actually lays out a pretty clear path for this phase. First, you keep them in suspense with calculated surprises. Then, you use really poetic, flattering language to get their guard down. After that, you disarm them by showing a moment of weakness. But it's strategic weakness, right? It makes your moves feel genuine, not like a plan. And then, here's the most critical step. You start to isolate them.
So the ultimate goal here is to craft this perfect illusion. You tap right into the target's secret wishes, their daydreams, and you make them believe that you are the person who can make it all real. And slowly but surely, that line between what's real and what's just a fantasy, it starts to completely dissolve.
And this brings us to a chillingly effective strategy. An isolated person is a weak person. It's as simple as that. By systematically separating them from their friends, their family, their familiar routines, their defenses just crumble. And in that state of confusion, they become so much more vulnerable to your influence.
But what happens when the mind games aren't enough? This brings us to a real turning point in the process. Once the target is hooked on this mix of pleasure and confusion, the source says it's time to go deeper. And yeah, this is where the tactics get way more extreme.
Okay, welcome to phase 3, the precipice. And this whole phase is about one thing, completely overwhelming the target's emotions. The tactics here become shocking, intense, and they're designed to push every single boundary to forge a bond that's powerful, almost unbreakable. So what are these extreme measures? Well, the text argues for these big, self-sacrificing deeds to prove your devotion. It also suggests leading the target into, let's say, transgressive territory, exploring taboos to create a shared sense of guilt. And then, most controversially, it flat out advocates for mixing pleasure with pain.
The core argument here, and you can see it visualized, is that just being nice all the time, it's actually not that effective. It just gets boring. The source claims that by strategically inflicting some pain, starting a fight, making them jealous, you create these really low emotional lows. And what that does is it makes the highs of pleasure that follow feel so much more powerful. And that's what creates this deep, deep bond of dependency.
And now we're here. The end game. All that psychological work we've talked about, the desire, the confusion, those crazy emotional highs and lows, it has all been leading up to this single moment, the final, decisive action.
What's so brilliant about this final phase is this total reversal that happens. The seducer, who's been pulling all the strings, suddenly just takes a step back. You might pretend to be bored, or maybe show a little interest in someone else. This sudden fear of losing you forces the target, who by now is completely desperate, to become the one doing the chasing.
This quote really captures the feeling of this final step. The target wants you, for sure, but they might be too scared or hesitant to make a move. At this point, according to the text, things like chivalry and kindness, they go out the window. Hesitating now is seen as a fatal mistake.
So, the final piece of the puzzle is what's called the bold move. The idea is to just overwhelm them with a sudden, super confident action. It's designed to shatter any resistance they have left, leaving them no time for second thoughts, no time to think about the consequences. It is the physical checkmate to this entire psychological game of chess.
But, and this is a big but, the source warns that even after that final move, the game is not over, not by a long shot. That emotional peak is almost always followed by a crash, distrust, disappointment, that kind of thing. So the seducer has to manage this aftermath. They either have to end things quickly or start the entire process all over again, a second seduction to keep the fantasy going.
So in the end, this incredibly detailed 4-phase framework, from picking a victim to managing the after effects, it really leaves us with one huge question, doesn't it? Is what we've been looking at truly the art of seduction, or is it just the cold, hard science of manipulation? Because the line between the two, as we've just seen, is dangerously thin.
So today, let's talk about power, but maybe not the kind you're thinking of. We're not talking about armies or boardrooms. We're going to dive into a different kind of power, one that operates inside the mind. We're breaking down the secret history of seduction, and I'm not talking about romance here. We're talking about seduction as a sophisticated, timeless strategy for influence.
So let's start with the big question. For most of human history, power was pretty straightforward, right? It was violent, it was obvious. But underneath all that noise, something else was taking shape. A form of influence that was quieter, more subtle, and, in a lot of ways, way more powerful. So how did that even happen?
And this really gets to the core of it. On one side, you've got brute force. It's direct, it's merciless. But here's the thing. It's often temporary. You can force someone to do something, but you can't force them to want to do it. But on the other side, you've got seduction. Now this is a whole different ballgame. It's psychological, it's subtle, and its effects, they're designed to last.
So where did this art even come from? Well, you might think it was cooked up by some powerful king or a brilliant general. But nope. The truth is, it was born out of necessity. It was a weapon forged by people who had no other choice.
I mean, just picture the ancient world for a second. All the official power, all the armies, all the laws, that was all in the hands of men. So if you're a woman like Cleopatra or Helen of Troy, what do? Well, they figured out that these powerful men had one huge weakness, their own minds, their own desires. And they didn't just exploit it, they turned it into an art form, one that could bring empires to their knees.
And this quote about Helen of Troy, wow, it just nails it. This isn't just about being beautiful. It's about wielding that beauty with intention. Her eyes are like armies. Think about that. A simple glance becomes a strategic weapon, as devastating as an actual army. That's some serious psychological firepower.
And make no mistake, this was not about random charm. It was a cold, calculated method. Step 1. You create this alluring, almost godlike image of yourself. A fantasy. Step 2. You lure your target into a world of pleasure. Something totally separate from their normal, boring reality. Step 3, and this is the killer move. You confuse them with moments of coldness and indifference. And finally, that push and pull drives them crazy, forcing them to pursue you until they completely surrender their will.
So let's be really clear what we mean by seduction in this context. It's not about mutual attraction. It's a strategy. It's about getting inside someone's head, putting them on an emotional roller coaster of hope and despair, all to achieve a surrender that to them feels completely voluntary.
Okay, so this incredibly powerful tool was invented. But you know what happens with powerful tools, right? They don't stay secret for long. Pretty soon, this art form started to leak out into completely new territories.
And it's just fascinating to see how it evolved. What starts as a woman's tool for survival in antiquity, well, by the 17th century, men are getting in on the action, adding their own twist with seductive language. Then, in the 18th century, it becomes the weapon of choice for social climbers in royal courts. And by the 19th century, you have figures like Napoleon using these exact same principles on a massive scale to seduce entire nations.
I love this quote because it really says it all. Look, commanding an army, that takes a certain kind of genius, for sure. But it's direct. Seduction, on the other hand, requires a much deeper, more complex kind of intellect. It's about understanding human psychology, nuance, and strategy. It's the art of the indirect.
Okay, so that's the history. But what about now? This is where it gets really interesting, because the argument is that we are now living in an age where these principles aren't just present, they are absolutely dominant.
I mean, just think about it. In almost every part of our lives, brute force is just not okay anymore. You can't force someone to buy your product, you can't force them to vote for you, you can't force them to like your ideas. You have to persuade them, you have to charm them, you have to seduce them. These tactics have gone totally mainstream. And once you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. That soft sell in an ad that creates a desire for a product, not just a need for it. The absolute requirement for charisma in modern politics. The way the media builds celebrities into these grand, untouchable fantasies. It's all part of the same playbook, a constant subtle game of persuasion.
So, what kind of person actually thinks this way? What's going on in their head? Let's try to get inside the mind of the seducer and understand their worldview.
It seems to boil down to 4 key traits. First, their focus is always outward. They're not obsessed with their own feelings, they're studying you, learning your desires, your weaknesses. Second, they become a provider of pleasure and fantasy, filling whatever void they see in their target's life. Third, and this is a big one, they see life as theater and themselves as actors, free to play whatever role the situation requires. And finally, and this one's a bit provocative, they operate beyond good and evil. For them, it's a game, and traditional morality just gets in the way of.
And this Nietzsche quote, it just perfectly captures that final point. The idea is that the act itself, creating this intense connection, this love, operates in its own space, totally separate from conventional ideas of right and wrong. It justifies the means. So, in the end, when you strip it all away, seduction isn't some kind of mystical magic. It's a game of psychology. It's a craft that can be learned, practiced, and mastered. And in a world that so often frowns on open conflict, you could argue it's become the ultimate weapon, a subtle, psychological art of war, perfectly designed for our delicate times.
Let's talk about attraction. You know, it's one of the most powerful and maybe one of the most misunderstood forces in our lives. We have this idea that it's some kind of magic quality people are just born with. But what if it's not? What if it's actually a skill? Something that can be understood and even learned? Well, today, that's exactly what we're going to explore through one of the most powerful archetypes of all time.
You know, for thousands of years, we've told stories about this kind of irresistible pull. In Homer's Odyssey, you have the Sirens, whose song was so beautiful, so alluring, that sailors would literally crash their ships into the rocks just to get closer. They were drawn to their doom by a promise of pure pleasure. That voice, it was like a force of nature. So, what is this power? Really? Is it just some old story, a myth meant to warn sailors? Or does it actually tap into something much deeper, something fundamental about what human beings desire? Well, according to the framework we're exploring today, this power isn't mystical at all. It's really the ability to radiate a quality that just pulls people in emotionally, sometimes completely against their better judgment. And here's the crucial part. It's presented as a learnable skill. It's an art form, really, built on understanding how we're all wired. So to get a handle on this skill, we're going to dive into a framework that breaks down attraction into 9 basic types, 9 archetypes, and each one taps into a totally different part of our psychology.
That's right, 9. 9 distinct paths to creating that allure.
And each one is built around one single dominant character trait that creates a very specific and very powerful kind of pull.
Okay, so what are they? You've got the siren, the rake, the ideal lover, the dandy, the natural, the coquette, the charmer, the charismatic, and the star. Now, all of them are fascinating in their own right, but for this explainer, we are zeroing in on what the source material calls the most potent of them all, this siren.
And you know, the best way to really understand an archetype like this is to see it in action. So we're going to look at two legendary historical figures who both embodied the siren, but in completely different and equally powerful ways.
On one side of the coin, you have Cleopatra, the spectacular siren. She was all about theater, royalty, a one-woman spectacle. And on the other side, Marilyn Monroe, the sex siren. She radiated this incredible mix of innocence and just raw primal desire. Both of them mastered this art, but wow, their playbooks were worlds apart.
So let's start with Cleopatra. What's so fascinating is that historical accounts say she wasn't a conventional beauty. So that begs the question, right? How did she manage to captivate the two most powerful men on the planet, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony? Well, the answer wasn't in her face. It was in her incredible gift for theater.
I mean, just look at this timeline. It's a masterclass. In 48 BC, she doesn't just ask for a meeting with Caesar. No, she has herself smuggled in and dramatically unfurled from a carpet. It's pure spectacle. For years, she keeps him in Egypt, not just with her personality, but by creating this whole world of games and adventures. And then, for Mark Antony, she tops it. She arrives on a giant golden barge, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite. She was a living fantasy, and they absolutely could not resist it.
Okay, so now let's flip to our other case study, Marilyn Monroe, who had a totally different vibe. Her story starts as Norma Jean, this girl in an orphanage who nobody really noticed. And the turning point was something so small, a borrowed sweater that was way too tight. All of a sudden, for the first time, every single eye was on her, and she realized, whoa, I have a power here. And this is just such a perfect example of how the siren persona can be built. It can be a conscious construction. She literally invented her famous walk for a movie. She trained herself to lower her voice to get that breathy tone we all know. And she spent years perfecting her makeup to create that iconic look. She wasn't just looking in a mirror out of vanity. She was an artist, and the masterpiece she was creating was herself.
But here's the thing. There was something more. It wasn't all an act. Her acting coach, Michael Chekhov, saw it. He told her that even when she wasn't trying, she gave off what he called sex vibrations. And it came from a real place, this deep, genuine need for love that made her seem so vulnerable. It was that mix, the manufactured glamour on top of that real vulnerability, that was just completely intoxicating.
So we've seen Cleopatra and Marilyn in action. But what were the actual tools they were using? Come on, let's open up the Siren's toolkit and see exactly what makes this power tick.
First up, the voice. A siren's voice is never rushed, never shrill. People who wrote about Cleopatra talked about how mesmerizing and sweet it was. And we just mentioned Marilyn, who consciously lowered her voice to get that breathy quality. The siren's voice is an instrument, and it works on you subliminally. Next, their appearance. And for the siren, this is not about fitting into whatever the conventional standard of beauty is. No, it's about creating a goddess effect, something larger than life, almost theatrical. The goal is to be a spectacle that literally pulls people out of their boring, everyday reality and puts them smack into a fantasy.
And finally, the way they move. A siren is never in a hurry, ever. There's this languid quality, like they have all the time in the world for pleasure. Their movements are graceful, and their gestures are ambiguous. They suggest both innocence and something erotic all at the same time. And it's that ambiguity that's just so incredibly seductive.
But there is one more element, and honestly, it's probably the most critical one of all. A little hint of danger. The siren represents an escape from the rational, responsible, everyday world.
The source material argues that this element of danger, of irrationality, is super attractive, especially to people who feel trapped by responsibility and always having to be in control. The siren offers this thrilling escape from all the rules, but it's an escape that always comes with a risk.
And that's why the perfect symbol for the siren is water. It's fluid, it's always changing, you can't hold on to it. It lures you in with this promise of infinite adventure and pleasure. But just like the sea, if you follow that call without thinking, you could drown.
Which brings us to the perils. Because let's be real,
Having this kind of power comes with some huge downsides. The constant attention can be totally exhausting. This archetype often makes other people incredibly envious and resentful. And historically, sirens from Cleopatra to Marilyn have had to fight off some really damaging reputations. And of course, an identity that's so tied to physical presence has to face the reality of getting old.
So that leaves us with one last question to chew on. The siren is one of the oldest fantasies we have. It's a myth, it's a legend, but its power to absolutely fascinate us hasn't gone away at all. So, what is the fact that we are still captivated by this archetype? What does that tell us about what we desire and maybe what we fear in the world today?
All right, let's dive into one of the most fascinating and, let's be honest, controversial figures you'll ever find in history and literature. The rake. So what is it about this character that just works? I mean, on paper, the rake is pretty much everything we're told to run away from. He's the classic bad boy, right? The one your parents absolutely warned you about. He lives by his own code, or more accurately, no code at all. And yet, he's completely irresistible. For centuries, this exact character has been this object of intense fascination and, yeah, desire. So what's the secret here? Why is this dangerous, totally untrustworthy person so incredibly appealing? Let's get into it. Okay, so the rake's real power, his whole secret sauce, lies in this very specific fantasy he offers. You know, in a world that often expects women to be civilized and play it safe, he represents a thrilling escape. It's a moment of pure, unrestrained, laser-focused attention. And this really gets to the heart of it. This isn't about love or marriage or any kind of stable future. No. It's about feeling, just for a brief, intense moment, like you are the absolute center of someone's universe. He makes a woman feel so completely and utterly desired that everything else just kind of melts away. So to really see this in action, let's look at our first case study, the Duc de Richelieu. This guy is basically the blueprint for what we'd call an ardent rake, a man whose entire seduction comes from bold, almost unbelievable actions. You gotta love this. Richelieu didn't just walk into court. He basically exploded onto the scene. At just 15 years old, his charm and his audacity were so potent that they actually got him thrown in the Bastille. But here's the kicker. The court found life so boring without him that the ladies begged for his return. His very presence was like an electric shock to the system. And just look at his methods. To seduce this one heavily guarded young woman, he didn't just, send her flowers. He launched a full-on military campaign. First, the notes to build anticipation. Then he pulls off this ridiculously dangerous disguise. And when that wasn't enough, he literally bought the house next door and tunneled through the wall. You see, for a rake like Richelieu, an obstacle isn't a stop sign. It's just an invitation to get more creative. And get this quote comes from one of Richelieu's sworn enemies. Even she had to admit his power was something else, almost supernatural. His reputation for going to any lengths for a woman got around, and that, of course, just made him even more desirable. But hey, not all rakes need to tunnel through walls. Some, like the Italian writer Gabriele D'Annunzio, had a different and maybe even more powerful weapon in their arsenal: their words. And this is what's so wild about D'Annunzio. To other men, he was, nothing special to look at. They called him a gargoyle. But when he spoke to a woman, her entire perception of him would just shift. He'd transform right before her eyes. So how on earth did he do that? Well, it was all in the delivery. His voice was described as hypnotic, musical. He used language not to just say things, but to create a whole emotional atmosphere, a feeling of being uniquely seen, understood, and desired. He knew that for many women, words are everything. And man, did he wield them like a master. And here's the thing, his skills weren't just for romance. He used the exact same techniques, the flattery, the suggestive language, the emotional appeals, from public balconies to sway entire crowds. It made him a celebrated war hero and a major political figure. It just goes to show you how these principles of seduction can work on a massive scale. So we've seen two very different kinds of rakes, one of action, one of words. Now let's try to boil this down. What are the core principles? What's the rake's actual secret playbook? First, a little bit of trivia that's actually super important. The word rake is short for rake hell, and a rake hell was literally someone who rakes the coals of hell. Now, that's not an accident. That little hint of the devilish, the forbidden, that's a huge part of the fantasy. So here it is, the playbook. First, Be completely lost in the moment. See resistance not as a no, but as a fun challenge that just makes things more exciting. Go to extremes. That's what makes you unforgettable. And this one is genius. Tap into that deep-seated fantasy of being the one who can finally tame the beast. And of course, all of this is built on a carefully crafted, very dangerous reputation. And this brings us to the central paradox of the rake. His biggest weakness, this apparent lack of self-control, is actually his greatest strength. His desire feels so real because it seems like even he can't fight it. What looks like a weakness is, in fact, his most powerful tool of seduction. Okay, so finally, let's talk about reputation and risk. Because being a rake isn't just some fantasy, it has very real consequences in the world. For the rake, reputation is absolutely everything. And it's not an accident. It's a masterpiece of personal branding. Think of it like advertising that draws women in, letting them know exactly what kind of thrilling, dangerous experience they're about to sign up for. And what's really interesting is that the biggest threat to the rake isn't always an angry husband or a jealous lover. Nope, it's often the envy of other, more conventional men. They see his freedom, his success, and it drives them crazy. They might try to tear him down, usually disguised as some kind of moral outrage. It all comes together in the rake's perfect symbol: fire. He burns with this desire that is contagious. It's uncontrollable. And yes, it is incredibly dangerous. He's literally playing with hellfire, but that warm glow is a massive part of his allure. So I guess that leaves us with one final question to think about. Is the rake just a character, a kind of fleeting fantasy for a world that's bound by rules? Or is he actually a timeless warning about the seductive and destructive power of chaos and pure, unrestrained desire? Something to chew on.
So, what if I told you that the secret to real influence, to real power, isn't about what you have, but about what someone else is missing? Today, we're diving deep into the art of becoming the ideal lover. And trust me, this is a strategy that goes way beyond romance. It's about tapping into the deepest fantasies that drive every single one of us.
It's the ultimate question, isn't it? The one that's inspired countless songs and poems. Why do we fall in love? What is that spark, that almost magical pull we feel towards one specific person out of billions?
You know, we tell ourselves it's about looks or chemistry or that we both like the same movies. But what if the real reason is something much, much deeper? The idea we're exploring today is that the key is a secret, maybe even an unconscious fantasy, a missing piece of ourselves that we're all desperately trying to find. Virginia Woolf absolutely nailed it with this quote. The most powerful people, they act as a kind of looking glass. They don't reflect who you are, they reflect who you desperately wish you were, at twice the size. And this is not a gender thing at all, it's a core part of human nature.
Okay, so to really see this looking glass in action, let's turn to one of history's most legendary seducers and his signature move, the Casanova method.
Giacomo Casanova. I mean, the name itself is basically a synonym for seduction. But here's the thing. His legendary success wasn't some kind of magic. Nope, it was a calculated, repeatable, and frankly, a brilliant method. Just take the story of the burgomaster's wife. Sure, she was beautiful, but more importantly, she was bored out of her mind. She craved adventure, a love that felt like it was worth sacrificing for. So what does Casanova do? He doesn't just send her flowers, no, he becomes her fantasy. He literally hides all day in a miserable, rat-infested chapel just for the chance of a secret meeting. He created the thrilling, sacrificial adventure she was starving for.
And this was not a one-off trick. For a lonely noblewoman named Miss Pauline, he became her perfect intellectual equal, a refined friend. But then for Ignazia, who was devout but bored by her own goodness, he became the complete opposite, a source of thrilling sin and torment. He wasn't one person. He was a chameleon of ideals, perfectly mirroring whatever fantasy his target had.
So, how in the world did he do it? Well, it all comes down to a core strategy we're going to call reflecting your fantasy.
This is the secret sauce, right here. The ideal lover method. It isn't about you at all. It's about them. It's about becoming a detective, observing people so intensely that you see past what they say they want, and you find what's truly missing. And then, you become the perfect mirror that reflects that missing piece right back at them.
It was like he was a doctor. He had diagnosed the fantasy and then prescribed himself as the cure. The woman lacking adventure, she gets a romantic hero. The one missing intellectual friendship, she gets a gentleman's scholar. The one starved for passion, she gets a tempting tormentor.
3 totally different women, 3 totally different fantasies, and so 3 totally different Casanovas.
And look, this was no accident. Casanova himself basically admitted his whole strategy. He said he strove to make myself agreeable. He knew that real seduction wasn't about being his authentic self. It was about becoming exactly what they needed him to be.
Okay, but can this method do more than just win a quick romance? Can you use it to gain immense lasting power? Well, to answer that, we have to meet a true master of the art, the Marquise de Pompadour.
I mean, her story is just the stuff of legends. A middle-class woman who, against all odds, captures the King of France and then holds his heart, an incredible power for 2 decades. How did she pull it off? It wasn't just her looks. It was a 20-year masterclass in the ideal lover method.
So, like any master strategist, she started by studying her target. King Louis XV, you'd think he's the most powerful man in France, he has it all, right? Wrong. He was a man plagued by a soul-crushing boredom and a deep-seated inferiority complex, always living in the massive shadow of his predecessor, the Sun King.
So what did Pompadour do? She didn't just try to be pretty. No, she went to work. She completely obliterated his boredom with endless novelty, theater, new projects. She bypassed his simple desires and went straight for his hidden ideals. She saw the great man he secretly yearned to be and held up a mirror that reflected that glorious image. With her, he wasn't just a king fooling around, he was a great patron of the arts, the man who would define an entire aesthetic era.
So you have the serial seducer and the royal mistress. What's the common thread here? They both mastered the fundamental psychology of idealization.
Okay, here is the mind-bending truth at the center of all this. We don't really fall in love with another person. We fall in love with the version of ourselves that they seem to awaken. We're all walking around with these dreams of who we could be, more adventurous, smarter, more noble, and we are just irresistibly drawn to the person who makes those dreams feel real.
So you see, there are really 2 paths to attraction. The physical path, that's temporary, it's replaceable. But the ideal path, appealing to someone's best self, that's what creates a lasting, powerful connection. It makes them feel elevated and truly seen, and that gives you an almost limitless influence.
The philosopher Nietzsche totally got this. He saw the beautiful deception at the heart of love. It acts like a spotlight, right? It only shines on the rare and exceptional things we want to see, making us believe, just for a moment, that the fantasy is the reality.
But spotlights can flicker. Fantasies are fragile things. So what happens when the harsh light of reality comes crashing in and reveals the messy, imperfect human being behind the ideal?
This is the #1 danger to this entire strategy: reality. You're playing a role, but you are still human, and when your own flaws and imperfections inevitably show up, the whole fantasy can just shatter.
And history is just littered with these burst bubbles. When the writer George Sand got a very unromantic case of dysentery, her lover's idealized image of her was completely destroyed. Casanova knew this danger really well. That's why he often skipped town right at the peak of the fantasy, before the messy reality of his own character could ruin the show.
So what's the solution when reality breaks the spell? Well, often it's distance. Absence gives our memory the space it needs to kind of smooth over the rough edges of reality and start rebuilding that beautiful fantasy all over again.
So, in the end, the ideal lover is like a portrait painter. They study their subject, sure, but they choose what to emphasize and what to ignore. Under their artful gaze, all your imperfections vanish. They bring out your noble qualities, frame you in a myth, and make you feel godlike. And for giving someone that priceless gift, the chance to fall in love with their own ideal self, the reward is immense and unforgettable power. The only question is, what will you do with it?
You know, we live in a world that just loves to put people in boxes, to categorize everything. But what happens when someone just refuses to be categorized? Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most fascinating and, seductive archetypes, the dandy. And we're going to break down exactly what makes them so powerful.
Let's start with something I think we've all felt, that feeling of being boxed in, pushed to conform to what society or your job or even your family expects of you. It's this constant frustrating pressure, right? And that's where it gets interesting. What if a person just says, nope, not playing that game? What if they invent their own persona, one that nobody can quite figure out or pin down? Well, that's the space where the dandy comes to life. So to really get a handle on the dandy's power, we first have to ask, what exactly is a dandy?
Okay,
At its core, a dandy is just wonderfully, captivatingly fluid. You can't put them in a simple box. By mixing and matching traits we usually call masculine or feminine, they create this ambiguous, alluring presence. And honestly, it hints at a kind of personal freedom that, deep down, a lot of us really crave.
Let's see this in action with a man who absolutely perfected this art form during the silent film era, the one and only Rudolph Valentino. Valentino's rise to fame was, wow, it was like a rocket ship. He got his start as a taxi dancer in New York. His job was literally to dance with women, to please them, to make them feel graceful. This was his training ground. It taught him exactly how to mirror a woman's psychology, how to put her at ease, and how to lead with this confident grace that was just completely mesmerizing. By the time he got to Hollywood, he was already a master.
But here's the secret sauce to his appeal. It wasn't just his feminine side, it was the dangerous combination. He had this graceful delicacy, sure, but it was always mixed with this undercurrent of conquest. He could seem so attentive and sensitive, but you always felt there was a little hint of cruelty just below the surface. He'd wear flowing robes and makeup, but then make these bold, overwhelming moves. It's that thrilling blend of opposites that drove audiences completely wild. And this all comes together in one of his most legendary lines from the movie The Sheik. The heroine asks him why he's brought her to his tent, and he just hits her with this audacious question. I mean, wow. It's the perfect summary of his style, a deep, almost feminine understanding of psychology, paired with total masculine dominance.
So when you boil it all down, Valentino's seduction was a masterful performance. It was like he was wooing as a woman would if she were a man. He used all these traditionally feminine weapons, paying attention to detail, showing sensitivity, using a slower rhythm to completely disarm his target. And then, right when she was mesmerized, bam, he'd make a bold, overwhelming, masculine move. It was sheer artistry.
All right, so that's the feminine dandy. Now let's flip the script and look at the inverse. A woman who used masculine traits to absolutely captivate some of the greatest minds in Europe. Lou Andreas Salome. The effect this woman had on men was just legendary. I mean, think about this for a second. We are talking about Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most intense, brilliant, and uncompromising philosophers in history, and he was just completely floored by her. He even proposed marriage, which, by the way, she turned down.
And this wasn't some fleeting crush either. Her power had serious staying power. The great poet Rainer Maria Rilke, who had been her lover, was still obsessed with her decades later on his deathbed. That just shows you the almost mystical, lifelong hold she had on the men who fell under her spell.
But it wasn't all just dreamy admiration. There was a dark side to it. One of her later conquests, a psychotherapist, actually called her a vampire, which tells you everything, right? It highlights the terrifying yet totally thrilling nature of her power. She stirred up these feelings that were deep, dark, and utterly irresistible.
So what was her secret? What was in her toolkit? Well, it was a killer combination. She wasn't just beautiful. She was an intellectual powerhouse who could go toe-to-toe with the greatest minds of her day. But her real power came from blending that conventionally masculine energy, her fierce independence, her analytical mind, her emotional detachment, with her undeniable feminine charm. Men just didn't know how to handle a woman who used their own weapons of logic and cool detachment against them. They were completely and utterly disarmed.
Okay, so we've seen a couple of amazing examples. Now let's get into the mechanics. How does this actually work? What are the core principles that make this archetype so incredibly powerful? It really boils down to these 4 core arts. It's like a recipe. First, you create a unique aesthetic style. You're different, but not tacky. Second, you have this supreme impudence, this total confidence that shows you could not care less about pleasing anyone. Third, you turn your entire life into a work of art. And finally, the masterstroke. You learn to enter the spirit of the opposite sex, to mirror their psychology.
This is a classic example of that supreme impudence. After one of his plays, the audience is just screaming for him, giving him a standing ovation. He eventually strolls out, smoking a cigarette, and basically tells them off for interrupting his smoke break. And for this, they loved him even more.
And then you have this, which is just next level. A famously cheap guy drops a coin in the dark. So the dandy Count d'Orsay, instead of helping him look, pulls out a 1,000-franc note, a huge amount of money, and lights it on fire to provide some light. It was just this audacious, theatrical, and completely unforgettable gesture that showed his total disdain for money and convention.
But you know, when you play with social conventions like this, you're playing with fire.
And flaunting the rules can provoke a very, very serious backlash.
And here's the thing. One of the biggest dangers for the dandy often comes from their own sex. Valentino was adored by women, but men absolutely despised him. They felt threatened by his unmasculine appeal. And on the flip side, Salome was admired by men, but women distrusted her intensely, calling her things like an evil witch. When you cross those gender lines, it can inspire some really intense resentment.
This is such a crucial cautionary tale. It shows that even a dandy has to know where the line is. Beau Brummel was the original dandy. He built his entire career on his wit and style, but he made one joke too many, calling his powerful patron, the Prince of Wales, Big Ben to his face. That crossed the line. His patronage was cut off, and he ended up dying broke. It's proof that there's a very fine line between being audaciously theatrical and making a career-ending mistake.
So if we had to pick a symbol for the dandy, the orchid is pretty much perfect. Just like this rare flower, the dandy's power comes from a cultivated, almost unnatural kind of beauty. It's prized for its rarity and its profound, seductive ambiguity. It suggests both sexes, but ultimately, it's unlike anything else. Which leaves us with a final thought. In our modern age of personal branding and fluid identities, are we all, in our own way, trying to become dandies?